It was never going to happen. Walter Koenig was turned down as a Star Trek: The Next Generation writer. When Star Trek: The Next Generation launched in 1987, Paramount made it very clear that this was not a sequel series, but a bold, modern reinvention of Gene Roddenberry's vision. Out went the 1960s Starship Enterprise, and in came a new, sleeker vessel helmed by a bald, Shakespearean captain. The show was staffed by a mix of fresh writing talent, established television veterans, and just a handful of holdovers from the original series. But one notable Trek veteran who actively wanted to be involved found himself rebuffed: Walter Koenig, the actor who played Ensign Pavel Chekhov. Koenig has since spoken candidly about his failed attempt to join the new series, not as an actor, but as a writer. In interviews and at convention panels, he said, almost wryly, it was never going to happen. The story of how one of Star Trek's most beloved alumni was turned down for the writer's room of its most successful spin-off is a fascinating window into how the next generation carved out its identity, and why some of the franchise's earliest stars were intentionally kept at arm's length. From Ensign Chekhov to aspiring writer, by the mid-1980s, Koenig had long since put his Starfleet uniform in mothballs. After the original series ended, he'd reprised Chekhov in the animated show, in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and in all the feature films through Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. But like several of his castmates, he'd also branched out creatively. Koenig had written comic books, novels, and even scripts for other television series, demonstrating that he wasn't just an actor, he was a storyteller. He was hardly alone in this. Leonard Nimoy directed Star Trek 3 and 4. William Shatner co-wrote Star Trek V. Even Nichelle Nichols and George Takei wrote memoirs and stage plays. The original cast was a remarkably entrepreneurial group. Koenig, who had always been candid about his frustration at Chekhov's limited screen time, found a sense of control in writing. He scripted an episode of Land of the Lost and later created the comic series Raver for Malibu Graphics. By the time Paramount announced The Next Generation, Koenig saw an opportunity to contribute not in front of the camera but behind it. Paramount's new rules for Star Trek. The problem was that The Next Generation was deliberately structured to avoid the kind of old guard influence Koenig represented. Gene Roddenberry himself had been adamant that the new show would not become Star Trek: The Next Original Crew. He wanted it to stand on its own, free from the weight of nostalgia. That meant no guest appearances from Shatner or Nimoy in the first few seasons, no legacy characters as regulars, and crucially, no original series actors behind the scenes shaping storylines. This decision was not personal, it was strategic. Paramount executives feared that if the old cast had too much influence, the audience would see TNG as a retread. Roddenberry's staff drew a hard line. New ship, new captain, new ideas. Writers like D.C. Fontana and David Gerrold, who had worked on the original series, were initially involved but soon pushed out or marginalized. In that environment, an actor from the 1960s show pitching scripts was not going to find much traction. Koenig's pitch. Koenig hasn't shared every detail of the script he submitted, but he has said in panels that it was an episode idea he was proud of, something that combined hard science fiction with the moral dilemmas Star Trek was known for. In his telling, the story involved the Enterprise encountering a distress signal from a civilization facing extinction and being forced to weigh intervention against the Prime Directive. It wasn't an especially radical pitch, plenty of TNG episodes revolved around those themes, but Koenig thought his unique vantage point as someone who had actually played a Starfleet officer could bring authenticity. He'd lived in that world for years. Why shouldn't he write for it? But the answer from Paramount was a polite, resounding no. Koenig later summarized the experience by saying, "I tried to get a foot in the door, but it was never going to happen. They weren't looking for ideas from us." He wasn't even invited to pitch formally in the way outside freelancers often were during TNG's run. A missed opportunity. Looking back, it's easy to see why Koenig's application was rejected. The Next Generation was still struggling to define itself in its first couple of seasons. Early episodes were criticized for being too derivative of the original series. The last thing the showrunners wanted was for an original cast member to hand them a script that could feel like old Trek in disguise. And yet, one can't help but wonder what Koenig might have brought to the table. Chekhov was, after all, the young ensign archetype, a viewpoint character not unlike Wesley Crusher in TNG. Koenig understood that role deeply. He also had decades of experience working with Roddenberry's material, which could have lent nuance to the new show's Federation politics and ethics. Fans still speculate about what kind of episode Koenig might have written. Would it have been a tense Cold War allegory like Balance of Terror? A time travel story echoing Star Trek IV? A moral dilemma akin to The Measure of a Man? We'll never know. But his rejection remains one of those tantalizing what-ifs in Trek history. It was never going to happen. Koenig's famous quote about the experience, "It was never going to happen," reflects a kind of resigned understanding. He didn't take it personally. In fact, he's continued to praise The Next Generation as a worthy successor to the show that made him famous. At conventions, he often jokes that while he was turned down as a writer, at least he wasn't asked to play Chekhov's grandson or some other gimmicky cameo. His attitude contrasts with some of his fellow original series alumni who were more openly critical of TNG. James Doohan Scotty once called the show a bunch of cardboard cutouts before later appearing in the celebrated episode Relics. Koenig, by contrast, kept his distance and expressed admiration for Patrick Stewart and company. In a sense, Koenig's rejection as a writer underscores the professional boundaries that allowed TNG to thrive. The series only truly came into its own in its third season, when it had built a writing staff, including Ronald D. Moore, Michael Piller, and Brannon Braga, who had no direct ties to the 1960s show. That outsider perspective helped the franchise reinvent itself for a new generation. Star Trek's strange history with alumni writers, Koenig's experience wasn't unique. Star Trek has a complicated history with alumni trying to contribute creatively in new ways. George Takei pitched a Star Trek story in which Sulu became captain of his own ship. It never materialized until Star Trek VI. Nichelle Nichols proposed storylines focused on Uhura that were ignored. Even Leonard Nimoy initially struggled to get Paramount to back his directing ambitions until Star Trek III became a hit. In that sense, Koenig was just one more name on a long list of creative people who loved Star Trek but found its gates tightly guarded. Ironically, the franchise has become more open to alumni contributions in recent years. Ethan Peck, who plays Spock in Strange New Worlds, has directed shorts. Writers from older series have returned to consult on newer shows. But in the late 1980s, the line between old Trek and new Trek was enforced with almost military precision, the legacy of Koenig's attempt. If nothing else, Koenig's story highlights his enduring passion for the franchise. He didn't need to pitch a script. By the late 80s, he was already a household name among sci-fi fans. But he wanted to contribute, and that impulse speaks to the collaborative spirit that has always defined Star Trek. He eventually found another outlet, writing novels like Buck Alice and the Actor Robot and creating original comics. These projects let him explore themes similar to Star Trek without being constrained by Paramount's rules. Fans who read his work often remark on the moral complexity and satirical edge he brings, qualities that wouldn't have felt out of place in a TNG script. And of course, Koenig finally got his writer's revenge of sorts when he penned his own Chekhov's Enterprise memoir and later appeared as the villainous Bester in Babylon 5, a show renowned for its serialized, writer-driven storytelling. In that role, he arguably had more creative impact than he ever could have at writing it.